Hello. Today we're going to talk about two artist homes that I visited. I think we're spending a lot of time in our own homes. We're probably bored of them, so this is a way of traveling to other people's homes. Also, to say that the way in which you might receive and consume someone's home sometimes has nothing to do with the way in which they live in it. And I think the stories we tell around how people are living in those homes is as interesting as the homes themselves, the design of them. I think the stories that we don't see and the stories we can't quite grasp, I think are interesting. So I'll start with Kettles Yard, which is the former home of Jim and Helen Eade in Cambridge. I visited this, I think, last spring with some friends, and this was really interesting because this was their home for a period of about 15 years at almost the end of their life. I think it's interesting to think about home ownership these days and how difficult it is for uh, younger people, I mean, myself included. But this was a home that they basically bought on former farmland and former tenement buildings, and they sort of did it up and opened it up to students. And within 3-4 years, they were working with the University of Cambridge to get art students in because Jim Eade was a famous curator. He'd worked with the Tate, he'd worked in the UK, but also in the United States. And while working in Washington, he saw two homes which were associated with the universities there and thought, this is a great idea, let's do this in the UK. So came back to the UK, took his art collection with him, of course, everywhere he went, and sort of treated his home as a way of showing that work. And of course, the collection is immense. I mean, there's Georges Braque, Picasso's, Valenti, a lot of Valenti, some Eric Gill, uh, some Ben Nicholson, just a lot of really amazing artists that he would have known personally that would have been kicking around. And the house you can visit in sort of groups, and it's very, I guess, a very formalized process of visit. You don't just meander, but it's really a very beautiful way of presenting art. It's less clear how they would have lived in it. And so everything is kind of pristinely shaped, and the whole experience is there to make you feel like you're in an art museum and an art gallery rather than in someone's home. The home was set up in 1957. By 1970, they had an extension made at the bottom, which really feels a lot like a museum. That part of the building is really pretty, I guess, stark in comparison with the rest of the space, and much more formal. It's also a beautiful piano because Jim Eade also said that there should be musical performances there as much as possible. But from 70 to 73, this new extension comes in, and in 73, they move out. And they hand the whole thing to the University of Cambridge. And so I think in a way, this is an artist's home without being an artist's home. It's really the home as a project, and the home almost as a museum, and the home as the recipient of an art collection, and specifically designed almost for a visitor. Eventually they moved, and Helen Eade died not too long after that, and he did as well. So this is, sort of later life project. And I think that's also reassuring for people like me to think about the fact that you can have much, much later life projects. This is not a later life project. So this is the glass house. So Philip Johnson's one of his homes. And this was an interesting visit. And I visited this with a friend in Connecticut, where it is outside of New York, so sort of northeast of New York City. And this is a home that was also built around the same age or the same time as Kettles Yard. So in 1957, it was finished in 59. And this is Philip Johnson kind of sitting outside of the glass bit, because actually it's two buildings. The glass house comprises of a building that is made of glass, as you can see, and a building that is made of bricks, which is the brick house. So this is the brick house, and this is the glass house. And as time went by, he bought property immediately around that building and started adding lots of interesting follies, let's say, architectural follies, architectural pieces, but also art. He also had 2 galleries built. I mean, the whole site is, I'm not going to dive into that, but what I think is interesting about the glass house is the performative aspect to it. So the glass house building is open. Notionally, there's a bed there. There's a shower in the middle of it. And this was used to host parties. This was used to host important people. Some of the famous photography work includes a lot of Andy Warhol, who was a very good friend of David Whitney, who was Philip Johnson's partner, and the brick house. And the brick house has a little less kind of going on in terms of photography and famous photography, because in a way it is what's secret and intimate about the space. There's not even, in this book at least, there's no photography of the actual bedrooms. The only one you see is the famous photograph of Andy Warhol in bed and David Whitney just cheekily peeking out of the 3 windows, and there's only 3 windows at the back of the building. And I think the space is just so pregnant with all the things that are not being said about what's happening in these spaces. So the kitchen is actually in the glass house. So any food preparation, etc., you would be doing with other people and in a very collective sense, in a very public sense. And in the brick house is a larger bathroom, the bedrooms, etc. And so anything intimate is actually mostly happening in the brick house. And the brick house was actually being refurbished when I visited. And it's, I think, going to be interesting to see what happens when they open that up and any photography work around that part of the building, because I think it has as much to say as the more, I think, public side of the building. So they're 2 completely different homes in almost the same time, but in completely different places in the world. But they tell us so much about what's there, but also they don't tell us everything. So when you look at a famous person's home in the future, hopefully you think about the things that they're not telling you. So I hope you enjoy.